Hello, my name is Sean Peisert from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, the University of California, Davis, and I'm also one of the co-leads of Trusted CI. I'm honored to continue the discussion on data trustworthiness that my highly distinguished colleague Jim Basney began in his talk. In 2019, Trusted CI launched a community effort that examined the causes of random bit flips in scientific computing and common measures used to mitigate the effects of bit flips. To gather information for the report, we surveyed scientists using scientific computing, as well as operators of data repositories and computing systems ranging from small clusters to large-scale DOE and NSF high-performance computing systems. Our report, an examination and survey of random bit flips in scientific computing, was published in December 2019. The report can be viewed at the link shown on this slide. The presentation is designed to present a few highlights from that report, and we hope it will entice you to read the report in greater detail. As with many Trusted CI reports, this BitFlip report is intended to be a living document that will be updated over time to serve community needs. So comments, questions, and suggestions about the report are always welcome. This talk is about bit flips, the risk of bit flips for individual components involved in computing, and a handful of best practices that scientists may wish to consider implementing in order to protect their data and computation. This talk is not about malicious attacks to intentionally modify or corrupt data, or new research methods for detecting data corruption. It's also not about data errors or loss due to improper scientific design, miscalibrated sensors, bugs, unaccounted for non-determinism in computational workflows, and improper round-off and truncation errors. Finally, it's not about reproducibility, including inability to recreate the same software or hardware conditions that gave the original results, such as legacy code incompatible with modern systems, among other conditions. Those are all related issues and are worthy things to talk about, but are discussed elsewhere. And you can see our report for references to numerous recent published reports and papers that do address them. For those listening to this talk who are not computer scientists, you might be wondering what in the world is a bit, and how can one flip, and what makes one occur randomly. Binary notation is the representation of numbers as combinations of the digits 0 and 1. In contrast to the decimal notation most of us are used to in our daily lives that represents digits as combinations of the digits 0 through 9. In binary, a bit is the atomic element of the representation of a 1 or a 0. Bits can be combined together to represent numbers larger than 0 or 1 in the same way that decimal digits can be put together to represent numbers larger than 9. Binary notation has been in use for many hundreds of years, and advances in mathematics combined with electronic advantages in switching circuits and logic gates in the 1930s led to binary storage and logic as the basis of computing. Binary notation, with numbers represented as bits, are the basis of how most computers have stored and processed information since the inception of electronic computers. However, while we see the binary digits 0 and 1 as discrete, opposite, and rigid representations, in fact, 0 and 1 are typically stored magnetically and transmitted through malicious charges. In reality, both magnetism and electrical charges can either degrade or otherwise be altered through electronic forces or external forces, including cosmic rays or other forms of radiation and magnetism. To a computer, a bit flip is the change of the representation of a number from a 0 to a 1 or vice versa. Underlying that flip could have been a sudden burst of radiation that suddenly and instantly altered magnetic storage or electrical transmission, or could have been the slow degradation of the magnetism of a magnetically stored bit from something close to 1, or a full magnetic charge, to something less than 0.5, at which point it would be recognized and interpreted as a 0. Our report describes the reasons why these bit flips occur. These include isolated single errors due to some kind of interference, radiation, or corrosion of metals, and bursty faults from a number of sequential bits, as might arise from mechanical failures. The use of error correction in computing and communication was pioneered in the 1940s and 1950s and leveraged redundancy to help identify and mask the effects of bit flips. Despite the creation of these techniques 70 to 80 years ago, it's still not the case that error correction is universally used. And even when it is, there are limits to the amount of errors that can be incurred in a particular blob of data before the errors can fail to be correctable or even to be detected at all. In fact, in many places in scientific research computing, scientists tend to assume bit flips are dealt with automatically and systems are generally simply trusted. While this is not true, its consequences can vary. In some cases, such as an election, a single bit flip is clearly vital, since a single bit can determine if a race is won or lost by a given candidate. In science, this arises most frequently in certain types of metadata, where corrupt data might be catastrophic. Since most science data contains noise, scientists are used to discarding certain types of outliers as inconsequential. A good example is image data, which can frequently contain distortions or other anomalies regardless of flipped bits. Alternatively, for a set of time series events, there's an assumption that if you don't have every single point, or some individual point is off, as is frequently the case with sensor data, that you just throw the point away. Or in situations where there are already multiple data streams collecting that cross-validate each other, the flip of a single bit, or even a small handful of bits, is also lost in the noise. Scientific cyberinfrastructure that tends to set the gold standard for addressing integrity is that which is designed specifically with preservation as a goal. Consider Data 1 and its constituent repositories. Hashes and checksums are used immediately upon ingest. Data is immediately replicated with the hash of the replicated object checked upon replication. Hashes are stored separately from data, and the data is write once, never delete. What about scientific computing other than in systems like Data 1? Well, most scientific computing seems rarely to do things that require extra effort from researchers or requires modifications to a stock computer system configuration. Other than maybe using backups, they simply assume the system is trustworthy. But this is definitely not reality. For example, while checksums are built into a lot of tools like SSH and Globus, and so researchers get integrity for free using these tools, network interfaces like REST APIs may be the Wild West. While some API authors will use SSL, many will not. And of course, HTTP and FTP simply rely on TCP checksums, which, as we'll discuss a little later, can be insufficient. Consider an automated chemical analysis workflow that is a representative example of a scientific computing workflow. In it, data is read by a network-connected instrument, manipulated and analyzed and stored in a database. At each step, data is transferred over an IP network and is handled by different servers. Most transfers are using FTP and implicitly assume TCP/IP checksums for integrity. No error-correcting file systems or redundant storage are used, nor are hashes taken of data. What would happen if something went wrong? What would happen if something went wrong? Bit errors on the data and files used in each step will have a different impact on the final results. If the analog data stream from the instrument has sudden changes in the recorded value, results can be assumed to be incorrect because researchers expect Gaussian-shaped signals on a noise floor. However, data elements containing time and masses have to be maintained in sequential order, and the workflow does not currently check this. Bit flips and metadata could have dramatic consequences. This could be partially checked if the data is in the expected ranges, which is not currently being performed as a check. After the raw sampled data from the chemical analysis instrument is analyzed, the resulting output is transformed. These derived values do not have redundancy present that enables error checking and would therefore suffer greatly from any bit flips. Only major outliers would be found in the final QA/QC processes. The good news is that data is backed up via the Google Drive web interface, but restoring would require significant and time-consuming work of restoring data and rerunning computations. The workflow could be improved in numerous ways. Storage could and should use encrypted file transfers for integrity protection. The project could also ensure greater integrity checking at relatively low cost by using ECC memory and ZFS at each point in the storage chain. Alternatively, cryptographic hashes could be used at each point in the process. In the next few slides, we'll briefly discuss a handful of components and the potential for faults within those components and potential mitigations. The undetected error bit rate of both internal buses and external cabling is 10 to the minus 12th. That seems small, but in long enough runs, or in sufficiently many runs, errors will arise. In practical terms, this risk is ignored in most systems, even though it can result in undetected errors. Consensus algorithms, such as Byzantine fault tolerance, can mask errors in addition to detecting them. although at a cost of required redundancy, slowdown, and the effort to modify code or workflows to leverage the consensus algorithms. Masking errors is most important where the consequence of small numbers of random errors is very high, or in situations where the random error rate is particularly high, such as in environments with increased amounts of ionizing radiation, such as at high elevations or in the Earth's polar regions. We discuss extreme environments more in the report. In storage devices, many errors are detected and corrected by hard disk drives and solid-state devices using the ECC CRC codes that are stored on disk for each sector. If the disk drive detects multiple read errors on a sector, it may make a copy of the failing sector on another part of the disk by remapping the failed sector of the disk to a spare sector. This silent correction can be monitored using tools that automatically check the disk drive for impending failures. This remapping is particularly important for SSDs, as sectors age quickly with the number of bytes written. In a recent study of 1.53 million disk drives over 41 months, it was shown that 400,000 blocks had checksum mismatches. In order to gain more reliability, one can use multiple drives in a RAID configuration, where parts of the storage are used for redundancy. By default, RAID 1, RAID 5, and RAID 6 and derivatives protect against failed devices, but not bit errors, by allowing for a certain number of failed devices before data loss. RAID can be used to detect errors as well as manually triggering integrity checks or rebuilds. RAID 5 and RAID 6 can fix errors in addition to detecting them through the same process. The downside of manual detection is the potential to not capture errors until the validation period, and only discover later that any derived data calculations made on the erroneous data are in the interim or wrong. An alternative to manual hardware-based integrity checks is to leverage software checks provided by some file systems, such as BTRFS and ZFS. These can use internal data and metadata checksumming to detect silent data corruption. ZFS, for example, can use SHA-256 to validate data integrity, reducing the probability of undetectable and uncorrectable errors to less than 2 to the minus 256 per file. This can also help identify failing storage devices. In addition, if a corruption is detected and the file system uses integrated mechanisms that provide data redundancy, such as ZFS's RAID-Z, such file systems can also reconstruct corrupted data in a transparent way. This error correction takes place at the cost of requiring multiple disks, but provides strong guarantees against masking any random data integrity failures. In networking, with TCP/IP, there will be transmission errors. The TCP checksums can detect up to 15 flipped bits per packet. However, bit flips can exceed the detection accuracy of the TCP checksum. In fact, the 2000 report noted between one packet in 1100 and one packet in 32,000 can fail the TCP checksum. It said, "We conclude that the checksum will fail to detect errors for roughly 1 in 16 million to 1 in 10 billion packets." To give an example, for a 100 terabyte FTP data transfer, we might expect to see up to 60 million errors, from which as many as 4,000 errors will not be detected by TCP checksums. An alternative method is to utilize cryptographic checksums such as SHA-1 before and after the transfer. The additional error detection can cause I/O and computation overhead. Checksum overhead for computation and I/O has been reported to be anywhere between 30 and 100%. Alternatively, in Secure Shell 2, a 20-byte SHA-1 is used on every packet, resulting in an error detection rate of 1 in 3.8 to the minus 25, which is approximately 13 orders of magnitude better than the TCP checksum, albeit at potentially much slower transfer rates achieved than by using grid FTP. A legitimate question about solutions for memory, storage, and data integrity might be, what about using cloud providers instead? Amazon S3 and Google Cloud Storage both guarantee 11 nines durability on object data storage. In order to transfer data into and out of AWS, the AWS tool CloudTrail can be used. It applies a SHA-256 on both sides of the transfer. In addition, a linked list-like structure is used to track any changes to files and make sure entire changes are not lost. What remains, aside from long-term data storage, data transfer and copy operations, are integrity during compute, which includes the processor and memory. Computations on Amazon EC2 are done with ECC memory enabled, significantly increasing memory data integrity. The remaining issue is integrity during computation, an area that cloud computing doesn't especially make easier because integrity during computation requires redundancy. At the same time, both memory and cloud computation are at least no worse than non-cloud computing, and may even be improved given the standard use of ECC memory and the presumed optimality of the environmental controls in cloud data centers. In our report, we also describe RAM, tape, databases, have more on errors in extreme environments, including ionizing radiation, including experiments looking at data storage that find that all hard disk drives under test fail under sufficiently high radiation, corroding cables, errors due to movement, and errors due to sound. Data integrity can be affected at every level of computer systems and communication between those systems. Our central point is that most of the time, data integrity can be relatively straightforward to address at low cost and effort. For data integrity during communications, using tools that have cryptographic checksums built in, such as SSH and Globus, largely solves this issue. For data at rest, distributing the data in multiple independent locations and using a file system such as ZFS that checks for and mitigates integrity failures, alongside a hardware solution, such as RAID 5 or above, that guards against disk failure, and also largely solves the issue for storage. Alternatively, the use of cloud computing resources appears to provide similar protection. And of course, data should be backed up alongside cryptographic hashes and periodically spot-checked to ensure no variation from the expected hash. Now that the use of tools such as SSH, ZFS, RAID 5, and cloud computing resources such as AWS and GCP are common in many environments, and Globus is well entrenched in the scientific community, taking these steps has gone from being a time-consuming process to one that's relatively turnkey. Just about every scientific computing effort should be making the effort to configure systems that ensure adequate data redundancy, which will largely address data integrity due to natural faults. While rare exceptions exist that will require more effort, these exceptions are certainly fewer in number, and can and should likely be addressed on an individual basis by reviewing specialized equipment made for specialized circumstances. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to taking your questions.